Merci, Senator, for the prayer. Tansé. Tansé. Bonjour, Sego, Ani. My name is Margaret Froh, and I want to begin by acknowledging the territory that we're on. It's always a blessing to be in a place like this, which has been a gathering place for thousands of years. So it's only fitting that we're here today to mark this very important day, which is the 127th anniversary of the death of Louis Riel. And in marking that, we're not just talking about the death of Louis Riel, we're talking very much about the life of Louis Riel and the life that lives on through the amazing work that so many such strong advocates are doing, and which is very much why we're here today to hear from some of them. So I'm going to be the moderator for this afternoon. Just to give you a little bit of information about me, I'm Métis from Saskatchewan. I'm one of 8 children, so I literally answer to just about anything. My father rarely even got the gender right when he was calling us by name. I'm a lawyer, and in the spirit of true Métis entrepreneurship, I've just recently started my own practice and consulting business. So this place is not new to me. I came here in the year 2000 to start in the role that Marisha Roman is now serving as Aboriginal Issues Coordinator for the Law Society. And that position was created as a full-time position here, very much as a part of a result of lobbying from the Indigenous legal community. And I had the good fortune to be here for 4 years doing that. So this type of an event, where we really are bringing together members of the public, members of the nation, lawyers, together to talk about these issues, is a very important mandate of the Law Society of Upper Canada. So I want to thank the Law Society for inviting me back here to chair today. And I understand that the Law Society is very pleased to be co-hosting again this year. And I'm trying to remember what year we started this. I think it was 1999, where we did partnerships to mark Louis Riel Day. So this relationship has been ongoing for a while. And on behalf of the Law Society, they wanted to acknowledge that important relationship with the Métis Nation of Ontario. So before we begin the panel, I'm going to call on Bencher Susan Hare. She's going to be bringing greetings on behalf of the Law Society Treasurer. I don't know if Susan plans to tell you what benchers and treasurers are all about for those non-lawyers in the room. She's not. So benchers, for all of those that don't know, are basically our directors. So we have what is called a convocation, which is really just a board of directors for the Law Society. And the Law Society is the body that governs all lawyers and paralegals in Ontario. So Susan is Anishinaabe. She's from Chagin First Nation here in Ontario on Manitoulin Island. And Susan has been very busy. Even as a student, I remember meeting her as she was just finishing her law degree at Osgoode. She advocated there to create an Osgoode intensive program in First Nation lands, resources, and governance. She's adjudicated a variety of institutional abuse matters, including Indian residential school claims. She also practices Native child welfare law and criminal law, and that's based out of her practice on Manitoulin. She's a bencher of the Law Society of Upper Canada and was just re-elected to serve her second 4-year term as bencher last year. So I'd ask Susan to come up and bring greetings and introduce our first speaker, President of the Métis Nation of Ontario, Gary Lipinski.
Honey, it's really hard to get up on a stage and not want to do this. Dorothy Grant said whenever I get the opportunity, I have to do that. Okay, good afternoon, bonjour. Nangosa Gusha, Nadezhnakas. Senators, members of the judiciary, members of the Métis and First Nations communities, Maria Campbell, fellow Law Society members, honored guests, and friends. On behalf of the Treasurer of the Law Society, Tom Conway, I am very pleased to bring greetings and to welcome you to the Law Society for our 10th annual Louis Riel Day public legal education event. Today's program could only be possible because of the good relationship that the Law Society enjoys with its community partner, the Métis Nation of Ontario. During today's panel discussion, we will hear from leaders in the Métis community and the legal profession. Jean Taillé and Jason Madden will share with us their views about the latest legal developments for the Métis community in Ontario and across Canada. On December 13, 2011, the Supreme Court heard presentations from the parties and interveners to the Manitoba Métis Federation case. Jason and Jean represented Métis interests in that case. While the decision has still not been released, I look forward to hearing more about their respective experiences and their hopes for the future of Métis legal rights. We will also hear today from Dr. Brenda McDougall, Chair of Métis Research at the University of Ottawa. We heard from Brenda when she was first appointed to this position, and I look forward to learning more about her research. Taken together, these presentations will provide a full spectrum view of the issues facing the Métis community as it continues to assert its legal status as one of Canada's Aboriginal peoples. It was less than 10 years ago, in 2003, that the landmark case of Steve and Rod Powley, father and son, was heard by the highest court in this country. The Supreme Court of Canada released its unanimous decision on September 19, 2003. In its judgment, the Supreme Court stated that the Powleys, as members of the Sault Ste. Marie Métis community, could exercise a Métis right to hunt that is protected as an Aboriginal right by Section 35 of the Constitution. Since that decision, the leadership of the Métis community has worked to translate these legal concepts into tangible reality for the communities. Today's event is a unique opportunity not only to reflect on the developments of the past 9 years, but also to have a look at what could happen in the future if the Métis are again successful at the Supreme Court in the MMF decision. It is the Law Society's purpose and hope that through today's educational program, both the legal professions and the public will gain a greater understanding of the role of Louis Riel and the Métis community in our collective history and our future. As part of the Law Society's mandate to govern the legal professions in the public interest, we work to be proactive and responsive. We reach out to the diverse communities we serve in Ontario to make justice accessible for all, and to all. Through events like today's program, the Law Society continues its engagement with the Métis and other Aboriginal communities and its work with Métis and Aboriginal lawyers and judges to promote equality and diversity in the legal profession. I would like to conclude once again by thanking our partner in presenting today's events, the Métis Nation of Ontario. We value your partnership, and we thank you for your ongoing support in advancing the cause of justice. It is now my honor to introduce Gary Lipinski, President of the Métis Nation of Ontario, to the podium. Mr. Lipinski was acclaimed as President of the MNO in May 2008. He started his political career as a councillor on the Sunset Country Métis Council. He gradually progressed through the political structure. From 1999 until his acclamation, Mr. Lipinski was chair of the Métis Nation of Ontario. Join me in welcoming Gary Lipinski, and I hope that you enjoyed today's program.
On behalf of the Métis Nation of Ontario, first of all, Venture Susan Hare, thank you so much for your opening comments and your introduction. And certainly, I want to say that the relationship that we have with the Law Society here is one of immense importance to the Métis Nation of Ontario, and certainly from our perspective, one that's been of extreme mutual benefit. This relationship has allowed us over the years to bring forward in an academic way issues that are relevant and important to the Métis people, but also to Canada in the larger context of where Métis people can find a place within Canada. And I think it's important to remember that these are in fact the same struggles that Riel gave his life for in 1885 on this very day, November 16. So in so many ways, the work that we continue, the leadership of the Métis Nation at all levels, continues today to look for our proper place as Métis people, as the Métis Nation within Confederation, within Canada. And that's what, why we particularly choose to have these discussions on this important day, to remember that those issues remain to be addressed. And so tonight we want to focus in, and the panelists will be focusing on a particular theme, because since the days of that we lost probably Canada, certainly the Métis Nation's greatest leader, Louis Riel, where he was executed on this day, to today, there are many certainly historical milestone events I think that we could all reflect on that have been important watershed moments in Canada's history. And so one of those, which the panel will cover in no doubt in a great deal of detail, will be 30 years this year, Section 35 inclusion of the Aboriginal peoples in our Constitution, and particularly with a focus on what that's meant for Métis. So undoubtedly our panelists will bring a great deal of discussion on that point. I think it's noteworthy, though, before we devolve right into that specific time period, that we look at a couple of other significant time frames in Métis people's historic pursuit of justice within Canada. And so, from our perspective as Métis people, Métis citizens, we have always been extreme contributors to the development of this country. Certainly, unquestionably, nobody can question our historic significance in Canada's emerging fur trade economy, and thus directly an impetus in Canada becoming the country it did through establishing that very first economy. But it was a wonderful moment just a couple of weeks back, a couple of weeks ago, where the Prime Minister of Canada and the Governor General of Canada recognized a number of Métis Nation communities and regions, Métis Nation Ontario being one of them, along with so many of our First Nations brothers and sisters who contributed to the War of 1812 in defending Canada, its borders, and once again allowing Canada to become the country it is. So it's somewhat with a number of ironies if we play through the historical record, where finally, after 200 years, we were recognized for our contributions in defending and helping establish the country that we all love and enjoy so much, to a number of years later in 1885, where the country would basically deny we exist as a people and have no rights as a people, and in fact execute our leader for putting out requests and negotiations to have a way of life protected within Canada, and to have some of those rights cemented in such significant documents as the Manitoba Act, where there's protection of minority language rights. And so that irony certainly cannot be lost upon us and the Canadian public as well. And continuing to other significant contributions that Métis have given throughout the development of Canada in these years, of course, our involvement being negotiators to help a number of the treaties that were eventually negotiated with First Nations, including, as an example, the Treaty 3, whereby Métis were promised lands within that treaty area, and to have the same rights and benefits as the said Indians of that. And yet, for, I guess, a message or a story that's not unique to Métis, for us, so many of those promises and visions remain unfulfilled. And so if we focus in, I guess, specifically looking at another promise that was made to Métis people 30 years ago, when Métis people were included in Section 35, again, what we saw to be, or hoped to be, another watershed moment, where we would no longer have to measure the passing of time through decades or centuries, but hopefully in a smaller time frame where we could begin to see meaningful progress on some of those historic issues that, again, Riel fought and died for in those days. We can hear the panelists and decide for ourselves, I guess, whether we've made significant progress, some progress, or the challenges that remain in front of us. And undoubtedly, we have successes, and so by no means do I want to paint a picture that is gloom and doom. And I think some of the successes, as has been mentioned, certainly the Powley decision, where the Supreme Court of Canada confirmed once and for all that when Section 30, Métis were included in Section 35, there were promises that came along with that inclusion. And the right to hunt and fish for food for sustenance was certainly one of those promises that were given to Métis people. And no longer could governments come before the courts or anyone else and say, as they had previously, and some almost to this day, that Métis don't exist, or that Métis don't have rights, or that their inclusion in Section 35 was just really to keep them quiet at the time, and there was no meaning put behind it. And so that was finally put to rest when the Supreme Court ruled on the Pauli decision. And again, for us, a watershed moment, hoping that we would be able to continue or perhaps accelerate the pace of some of the successes we might look forward to having. And we'll now be coming up on next year, 10 years after Pauli, and no doubt we'll have a discussion next year about 10 years post-Pauli, and specifically focus in on what's been achieved or not achieved, or what remains work in front of us after Pauli. And so for us, the work continues, and it's been a long historical pursuit for the full recognition and the proper recognition of our rights within Canada, and at the same time continuing to contribute, as we did historically, and to continue to contribute today to our countries and communities. It's something that we all love and cherish and are so proud of. And I guess quite simply put, for us, we've always viewed our rights and way of life as a basket of rights which is full. And it's frustrating. It frustrates us to continue to have to use the courts to go to court every time and get another right put in the basket and have to fight for each recognition of each individual right. There has to be a better way for the taxpayer, who obviously these are extremely costful ways of pursuing these. A better way for the Métis people and a better way for Canadians as well. And so certainly we all look forward as well to hear what is at issue before the Supreme Court of Canada, the MMF case. And once again, this case goes back to those historical days where Manitoba was entered into Confederation, and the promises that were made to Métis people. So I look forward to hearing the panelists, to what they have to present on these themes. For us, the work and the journey will continue. We have a strong leadership throughout the Métis Nation. Unquestionably, our future is so much brighter because we have young people coming up with just remarkable skill sets. And the youth of today will be incredibly strong future leaders for the Métis Nation in the future, but also proud contributors to Canada as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've always wanted to say that. So, as I mentioned earlier, this event is part of the Law Society of Upper Canada's public legal education program on equality. And you'll notice that the room, it's a very high-tech room, and that we've got people upstairs in booths and technicians at the back of the hall. This event is being recorded, and it's going to be webcast on the internet. And I understand as well it will be archived and available on the internet in posterity. So if there's something that you miss, or if you don't worry about taking notes today, just go back and watch it and invite all your friends to come and do the same. So these are really important events for our communities and for the Law Society. The Law Society's mandate to govern the legal profession in the public interest and to promote access to justice includes discussions like this one today. So I wanted to just welcome you to check out the Law Society website, find out about events that are happening there. I think almost monthly there's something going on here, and 2 programs a year that are specifically geared towards Indigenous issues, Louis Riel Day in November, and as well National Aboriginal Day program that's celebrated in June. So before I introduce the speakers, I wanted to just give you a quick outline of today's program. Each speaker is going to have 25 minutes to speak, which could be a little bit of a challenge for some of them. I'm not going to name names. But I actually have an iPad that I've got a little digital timer on, so we're going to keep them to the minute. There's hopefully going to be about 15 minutes for questions from the audience at the end of the 3 speakers. We're not going to have questions in between. It'll be at the end of the 3 speakers. So during that Q&A period, I'd encourage you, if you have a question to ask, to come up to a mic. As I mentioned, it's being recorded, it's being webcast, so we need to get your voice into that recording so that we don't have to repeat the question. And I'd also ask you, just given the amount of time that we have and for the respect of all participants, to keep your comments very brief and to get to your question. And while I don't have a really big cane, I will in fact cut you off if I have to and ask you to ask your question. That's probably going to be more geared towards this panel, but for them I actually am within reach. So. At about 4 o'clock, we're going to wrap up the panel discussion and we're going to take a refreshment break. That is going to be served, the refreshments are going to be served in room C, which is the room to my far left. Marisha is pointing. And then at 4:30, we're going to come back into this room for a reception. We have a live performance today with Rebecca Cuddy, who I haven't met yet, but I understand is a really fabulous performer. And I'm scanning the room. There's Rebecca. And then we are very, very, very lucky and blessed today to have one of my very favorite people here to do a reading. The renowned Métis author, Trudeau Feller scholar, grandmother, great-grandmother, Elder Maria Campbell is in the house with us today. So I wanted to acknowledge Maria. So now I want to introduce you to our panelists. And I have to say, this is a brilliant and beautiful panel. And that's something about Métis brains. I've commented frequently on how we tend to have very large heads. And I think it's because we're so smart. So we've got a brilliant and a beautiful panel today. So I'm going to do just a very brief introduction. Marisha's probably never going to ask me back to chair another event. Our first speaker is Jean Taillé. So Jean graduated from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 1994. She was 2 years ahead of me in school and was one of my mentors and is a very dear friend. She's a member of the bar in Ontario, BC, and the Northwest Territories. She's a part and Manitoba and the Yukon. We need to update her CV. She's a partner with the law firm Pape Salter Taillé, and I would have to agree with Franz Picot, and this is no offense, Jason, but you're still learning. Jean is the world's preeminent Métis lawyer, so I just wanted to take that opportunity to embarrass her further. Jean specializes in Aboriginal rights law generally and Métis law more specifically. She's been counsel on many of the Supreme Court of Canada cases that have defined Aboriginal and Métis rights in Canada, some of which Gary just spoke to. More recently, Jean represented the Métis Nation of Ontario as the intervener in the Manitoba Métis Federation case. That was heard last December by the Supreme Court of Canada, and we're still awaiting a decision on that. So for those of students in the room that are wondering about extensions on papers and stuff, you can look to that Supreme Court of Canada timeline on issuing decisions. Among the numerous recognition awards that Jean has been given for her legal and community work, Jean received the designation of Indigenous Peoples Council by the IBA, the Indigenous Bar Association, last fall in 2011. I was president of the Indigenous Bar Association at the time, and it was my very great honor and pleasure to be part of that presentation of that IPC designation. It is the highest honor that we as an Indigenous bar give in recognition of our members. Next to Jean is Jason Madden. Jason is another fabulous Métis lawyer. I have to be really nice to Jason now because I called him a baby lawyer. Jason is a Métis. He's born and raised in northwestern Ontario. He's a graduate of Osgoode Hall Law School and was called to the Ontario Bar in 2002, which was a whole decade ago. So you're doing pretty well, Jason. He assumed the position of General Counsel to the Métis National Council. He's been advising the Métis National Council and Métis groups from Ontario westward on corporate issues over the last decade, government policy, and ongoing Métis rights litigation. He has also acted as counsel for the Métis National Council in its interventions in Powley and Blais. He was part of the Métis Nation of Ontario's negotiating team, which was the first and remains the only Métis harvesting accommodation agreement in place in Canada. In Jason's private practice, he focuses on Aboriginal rights litigation, Aboriginal governance issues, as well as negotiations on behalf of Aboriginal communities with various levels of government. He was also involved in the Manitoba Métis Federation case in 2011 as counsel for the Métis Nation of Alberta, which was an intervener in that case. And next to Jean, is Dr. Brenda McDougall. Brenda is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Ottawa. And we've talked about this quite a bit already today, but the creation of the chair of Métis Studies at the University of Ottawa was a very significant advancement for Métis people in Canada. And Brenda is our first chair of Métis Studies. So she was appointed to that position in March of 2010, and that's based out of the University of Ottawa. Brenda has worked extensively with Métis communities in Saskatchewan, documenting the history of the Métis. She's also taught in the Native Studies Department at the University of Saskatchewan. Brenda's first book, One of the Family, Métis Culture in 19th Century Northwestern Saskatchewan, published by UBC in 2010, was the 2011 winner of the Canadian Historical Association's Clio Prize for Best Book in the Prairie Division. In her current role, Brenda is continuing her research into the history of the Ontario-based Métis community. And in addition to teaching, she's also begun a new project on the history of the Métis in the Treaty 3 region of Northern Ontario, and she's doing that work with the Métis Nation of Ontario. So I want to invite Jean up. I believe Jean is going to be the first speaker on the panel.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Bencher Hare for your very gracious comments. It's always a pleasure to see you, Susan, and Margaret as well, and President Lipinski. I did have this on a PowerPoint presentation, but I can't find it in my computer, so you're not getting high-tech today. I will say, though, that in addition to it, my presentation being part of what the Law Society is going to have online, this is about to be published in the Supreme Court Law Review. So any of you who are lawyers and want to access it, you can get it there. I have had one of my law partners is very ill right now, and so someone asked him how we all functioned, the three law partners, for the last 20 years. How do we live together and got along so well and done such work, the work we've done. And so Arthur was described as the man who always digs in on the principles of things. And Rick is described as the man who's always out there trying to figure out on a pragmatic, political, what's going to happen on the ground after we do this, or where is it going to take us. And someone said to Arthur, well, where does Jean fit into that picture? And Arthur said, Jean's the story. And I've been trying to grapple with that for a couple of weeks now, trying to figure out what it meant. But then when I was picking this up today, I thought, oh, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm telling you the story. So as President Lipinski told you, it is 30 years of Section 35. So 30 years since we got the recognition for Métis rights in the highest law in this land, the Constitution of Canada. And so I thought that one of the things I tend to think is that if you don't repeat your stories or keep telling them, then they get lost. So I thought I'll tell you the story of how we got into the Constitution and then what happened afterwards. And that's why I've also written it and am publishing it, because I think most people don't know the story. Now, the story I'm going to tell you, I'm not even telling you all of it, because I would need a lot more than the 22 minutes and 34 seconds that I have left. But I'm going to give you the outline of it. So we really have to go back to, I'm going to start in 1980. I could start before that, but I'm going to start in 1980 when the then Prime Minister Trudeau, not the Trudeau who's running around today, Justin, but his father, published what he called a proposed resolution for a joint address to Her Majesty the Queen respecting the Constitution of Canada. And really what that was his proposal to draft a Canadian Constitution, which, for those of you who don't know, we did not have before, right? We had some 90 separate documents that together made up our ruling ideas and principles of how we govern this country, but we didn't have it a constitution. And in fact, what we were governed under for the most part was called the British North America Act of 1867. So Trudeau wanted to patriate the Constitution and create one, essentially. So in this is it transferring constitutional powers from Britain to Canada, right? So following the publication of his resolution, there were a lot of demonstrations. And in fact, for those of you who are interested, there was something called the Constitution Express. Those of us who have some gray in our hair will remember that maybe. If you don't, you can go online and look it up. This was a gathering of Aboriginal people from across the country, and what they were doing was agitating for protection for Aboriginal rights to be put in this Constitution once it came back to Canada. I shouldn't say came back, once it came to Canada, because we tend to call it repatriation, but it really wasn't. We weren't anything. We were just bringing it for the first time. So as a result of that, in January of 1981, so the Constitution ends up coming in April of 1982, but in January of 81, there was a draft clause about Aboriginal and treaty rights, and it was this: the Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, as they have been or may be defined by the courts, are hereby recognized and affirmed and can only be modified by amendment. That was the first draft of this, right? So later on, they removed parts of those, the as they have been or may be defined by the courts, and the and can only be modified by amendment. Those parts were removed. They were thought to be redundant. We'll come back to that issue because it picks up on the point that President Lipinski was making about the fact that the box seems to be empty until you define one and put it back in. You can see from that clause where that idea comes from because it was there from the beginning. So that's the form that went to the court. Now, it was being debated. Now, there's a point where Jean Chrétien, who was then the Minister of Indian Affairs, he was not the Prime Minister, he was about to head into a hearing at the Senate, Joint Senate House of Commons Committee hearing, and Harry Daniels, again, another wonderful Métis leader from Saskatchewan. We have kicked up a lot of important people out of Saskatchewan. There's different versions of this story, but the one that Ian Waddell tells is that Harry literally grabbed Jean Chrétien by the shirt collar and said to him, "Métis are Aboriginal people. You have to put us in the Constitution." And so Sven Robinson, this is before he stole the ring and got completely ruined his reputation, at that point had a decent reputation. He grabbed a pen and apparently on a napkin or scrap piece of paper wrote, "Aboriginal peoples include Indian, Inuit, and Métis." And that's the basis of what is now Section 35.2. But it happened in the hallway as a result of Harry Daniels forcing the issue. So after that, there's a period where Aboriginal rights and women's rights get kind of at the same time taken out of the Constitution as everybody's jockeying for what they want in and what they want out, political power back and forth, Quebec saying this, BC wants this, Alberta wants that, nobody wants women's rights, nobody wants Aboriginal rights, right? So they go out of the Constitution, there's a hue and cry all over the country, women's groups go ballistic about their equality rights not being, having been dumped out of the Constitution. Aboriginal people as well start massive campaigns. I'm skipping through. It's a very interesting process. So if you're interested, you can pick it up, a lot of it on the internet. But as a result of a lot of political bargaining, it came back in, and the Women's Rights Clause came back in, and we're basically then in the Constitution gets passed. Everybody says it's a new day. The game is going to change. Everything will be different now, right? That's what they said. We're going to put to bed these past grievances, and we're going to start on a new foot where Aboriginal people won't have to be dominated by the law anymore. Not very prescient. So the other point that was going on was the clause, if you recall, was the Aboriginal and treaty rights, the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. Now there's a whole story about how existing got put in there that I think I don't have time to get into. But there was a big question. What are Aboriginal treaty rights? What does this mean? What does existing Aboriginal treaty rights mean? Nobody knew what it meant. And to be really frank about it, there was very little discussion in the House of Commons or the Senate about what on earth this meant, right? So Aboriginal people clearly thought, and in the writings and discussions you see of the people who were involved in those in that debate at that time, they clearly thought on the Aboriginal side that it included self-government. On the government's side, it never occurred to them at all that Aboriginal self-government was even vaguely considered to be in this pile here. Now, they didn't know what was in it, but nobody talked about it, including self-government. So the other thing was that they didn't have time to get into a big debate about it, so they did what lawyers always do. If you can't solve the problem, create a process down the line where everybody can go and talk about it and try to solve it later. So that's exactly what they did, and into the Constitution they put Section 37, which basically said that they'll have a series of conferences afterwards where they will debate what does Indian, Inuit, and Métis mean, and what is the content of Aboriginal and treaty rights, right? So they kicked the can down the road, right? That's what they really did. Okay, so they didn't kick it too far down the road because the first constitutional conference had to happen within the first year, and the other two, there were three of them, they all had to happen within 5 years. So that's what really happened. Well, we get to the first constitutional conference, and this is where we get the Métis kerfuffle. So what happened was when Harry Daniels grabbed Jean Chrétien by the throat and said, Métis are Aboriginal people, he was the head of a group called the Native Council of Canada, which was the umbrella group of Métis and non-status Indians, and actually status Indians who weren't on reserve. It was what we call a pan-Aboriginal group. It included a lot of people because you were pre-Bill C-31. So there were lots and lots of people in that group, and Harry was the president. So by the time you get to the first constitutional conference, though, Harry's not the president anymore, right? And so what you have is everybody gets 2 seats at that first conference, right? So the Inuit get 2 seats, the Métis the Métis are supposed to get 2 seats, and the Indians are supposed to get 2 seats. But what happened is because the Native Council of Canada was now run by non-status Indians, they put 2 non-status Indians up to go to the conference, which meant that you would have 4 Indians, 2 Inuit, and no Métis at this conference that was all about what are Indian, Inuit, and Métis rights about. So the Métis group in the Native Council of Canada, I won't say what they said actually, but it wasn't very pretty, but they actually got up and walked out of the Native Council of Canada, basically walked across the street, got some bylaws off a shelf, and created what we know now as the Métis National Council. They then went and got a lawyer, Jean Robert, who was later to become the Chief Justice of the Federal Court of Appeal, and just retired last year, and he was their lawyer, and they filed an injunction to stop the conferences from going forward until the Métis had a seat. So the compromise was that the Native Council of Canada would get 1 seat for non-status Indians, and the Métis National Council got 1 seat for Métis. Everybody accepted that, and then they went into the constitutional conferences. Well, the constitutional conferences from every angle were not successful. I don't know if you call them a failure, but if there was any intention to decide what the content of Aboriginal and treaty rights are in Section 35, absolutely no agreement on that. If there was any discussion or any attempt to figure out who the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, it says the Aboriginal peoples of Canada includes the Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. If there was any thought that that would get resolved, it didn't. So nothing got resolved. The only things that got added after the first constitutional conference was a very interesting clause which became Section 35(3), which essentially said that for greater certainty treaty rights includes rights that now exist by way of land claims agreements or may be so acquired. So really what that's saying, so remember the first part of it, the stem part is the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. And now 35.3 comes along and it says that, oh, by the way, you can enter into a land claims agreement and have your rights put into that, which I would say is completely inconsistent with the first part of the clause, which says only the existing rights, because Section 35.3 now gives you a new way to create existing rights, right? So they did that, and then the second thing they did was say that the rights were guaranteed equally to male and female people, and then they kicked the can further down the road and said they'd have 2 more conferences. So basically, nothing much got solved. Now, I shouldn't say nothing much, because the idea that modern land claims agreements, or that you can enter into an agreement that will give you constitutionally protected rights, is a really important step. But in terms of determining what the substance of the, if you consider Section 35 to be a box, what's in that box, the constitutional conferences did nothing towards that. And they really broke down entirely over the issue of self-government. All of the Aboriginal leaders were there saying, self-government, 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 self-government. And all of the governments were saying, no, no, no. Over, Peter Lougheed saying, no, over my dead body, you're not getting anything even remotely like that. If I thought that was what it was, I wouldn't even have agreed to put it back in the Constitution. So this is the state we're left at after the constitutional conferences are over. We haven't resolved anything. And then Meech Lake, remember Meech Lake? Comes along. At this point, the government is basically deciding to work without Aboriginal peoples at all. It's almost as if the constitutional conferences exhausted them and they, oh no, we're not going to do anything with you guys anymore. So they went ahead and they started to, Meech Lake was all about appeasing Quebec and bringing Quebec in to the Constitution that had been brought to Canada. And wasn't about Aboriginal people at all, but the remaining and enduring image in all of our minds about Meech Lake remains Elijah Harper with his eagle feather sitting in that Manitoba government, being the lone voice saying, what, we are not going to approve this. Now, Newfoundland didn't do it either, but what's the image that all of Canada remembers about the fall of Meech Lake? It's Elijah Harper. And why is that? It's because the government absolutely excluded all Aboriginal people from all of that process. So we go from there to Charlottetown, right? Here we go in our, we had a bit of a constitutional blitz back then. In the Charlottetown round, Aboriginal people were incredibly included in all of the debates, the discussions, the negotiations. They were there every day of that. And for the Métis people, this would have been a tremendous accomplishment. The Métis Nation Accord would have recognized that Métis would be included in Indians for the purposes of Section 9124, meaning they would be recognized as federal jurisdiction. If it had come through, there was a promise to work out protection of the settlements lands in Alberta. There was a discussion to recognize Métis rights. I mean, it would have been a wonderful thing. Unfortunately, Canada rejected the whole thing, so it all went down the tubes in Canada. Which is, governments tend to be slightly schizophrenic about these things. They say they get very deeply involved. All of their people are engaged in this process. Everybody's agreed on it. And then when it's all happened, when it doesn't pass a public referendum, all of the government people go right back to where they were 35 years before, which is no recognition and denial. So, which is where we were after Charlottetown. And so we had this sort of full box, empty box debate that went on. And I want to say that this full box, empty box debate is very serious. When, right after, I was trying to remember when it was that Ian Binney's famous statement was made, but I think it's back probably in 1985 or something like that. And Ian Binney, who was a former justice on the Supreme Court of Canada, and just retired a couple of years ago. He was the Attorney General, I think, or if not the Attorney General federally, he was in the Deputy Attorney General. But anyway, very high up public lawyer for the federal government. And when someone asked him what was in the section, what was the content of Section 35, he said that as far as he was concerned, the only thing that was in the box was the right to surrender land. That's what he said. When he said that, it was at a big meeting, ministerial level meeting. And there were a lot of people there, like hundreds of people there. Doug Sanders, who apparently was there, says that the whole room just went quiet for this couple of heartbeats, and then everybody burst out laughing. They laughed at him. They couldn't believe that a federal important justice minister could come, not minister, but justice official, could come and tell you that we had just done this thing, put this important constitutional provision in to protect rights, and the only thing it protected was your right to give it away? And we have since heard in court where lawyers tell us that the only thing it does is give you a right to go to court, right? Which I think these are appalling, shallow, and deeply disturbing ways of looking at a constitutional right. Nobody would tell you that your right to free speech is just a right to go to court. Nobody would tell you that your right to freedom of religion is a right to go to court, right? That's not what they would tell you, or the right to give it up. That's all your freedom of religion means, is that you can give it up. Nobody would buy that. Or your right as a woman to equal rights, the only thing that gets you is the right to give it up so that you're not equal. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. It's just completely contrary to the whole idea of having a constitution in the first place. So I think that what I see, I have like 4.5 minutes left, so I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about where we're at now. So that's the story of how we got in. That's the story of the battle to try and put some flesh on the bones of this constitutional provision. What happened after Charlottetown was that we decided that the only thing that could get some flesh on the bones was to go to court. So that's what we did. And so that is when Clem Chartier and I started the cases in northern Saskatchewan. There's a case from Manitoba. Powley case came along. It is an accident, by the way, that Powley was the first case that went to the Supreme Court of Canada. There were cases out of Saskatchewan earlier. It's just that the Saskatchewan government wasn't as vehemently anti-Métis as the Mike Harris government was here. And so they, after we'd win at trial and then we'd win on the first appeal, and then they'd not take it any further because they didn't want high court judgments, right? But it's really only because of the political antagonism here in Ontario that Powley went forward first. I actually think it's a good thing, because otherwise we would have had to take it anyway. Because if it had gone through in Saskatchewan, they would have said, oh yeah, but it doesn't apply to Ontario. There's still no Métis in Ontario. So the fact that it happened here was actually very good for us. But it has not really, it's been a hard one. Thing. I've sometimes that, you have people talk about how you snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. That's sort of how we felt after Powley. We had this victory and we couldn't make it count anywhere. Ontario was still charging people all over the place. We had to take them to court again to get them to stop doing that. Everybody was saying things like, well, there's no Métis here. There might be Métis in Manitoba, but there's no Métis here. People in Saskatchewan and Alberta saying things like that. And in Manitoba, even in Manitoba, where everybody else in Canada thinks if there's Métis anywhere, there got to be Métis in Manitoba. And Manitoba was saying the same thing. No, there's no Métis with any rights here. So there's been a long battle. Jason and I have been engaged in this for about 10 years now, and just continually fighting case after case after case to try and do that, to try and put something in those boxes. I would love to put something besides hunting and fishing rights in those boxes, but the truth is they don't charge women for picking blueberries. And I would love to take a woman's case, a case about somebody picking medicines or something like that, but nobody gets charged for it, so we've never been able to move that kind of agenda forward. Nobody gets charged for exercising their spiritual practices. Nobody gets charged for or even for self-government issues. So we can't add those in. So what the box is very lopsided. It's got hunting and fishing in it as if those are the only rights that exist or that anybody cares about. It's not, say it ain't so, Joe. I mean, it's not. We don't think they're the only things in the box, but it's the only things that we've been able to get any traction with, and we have actually managed to use that to get some recognition and to move the yardsticks forward. So that's good. What we have not accomplished, though, is getting the law changed. And I can't go into that in any detail in the 1 minute I have left, but the problem we have right now is that governments are not amending the laws. So what we have is a whole bunch of laws in the books that theoretically don't apply to Métis, but actually it becomes discretionary as to whether the government's going to apply them or not. So we are the only people in Canada who are actually being governed by policy as opposed to law. And I find that to be appalling, that here we are 30 years after Section 35 was implemented, and actually what it's resulted in for us is not a blanket of protection of law, it's actually resulted in the removal of law and the replacement of discretion. And I think that that's very disturbing, because discretion, there's a phrase in law, we talk about the chancellor's foot, you know, so that's the phrase for it, meaning that, you know, if the chancellor's a big man, it's a big foot. If the chancellor's a little person, it's a little foot. It's all about what's going on and whether he's angry or upset because he didn't like what he had for breakfast that morning, or his wife was mad at him. So then he's, you know, we should not be subject to political whim. We shouldn't be subject to that kind of discretion. Law should be transparent and understandable by everybody, and Section 35 has resulted in somewhat of a loss for us on that front. So I think that that's our challenge for the next decade. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. I love hearing the story about the Constitution. There's so many people that just take it for granted. And you know, when you go to law school, you read the book and you see what it says, but you don't know the story behind those words. And I think it's such an important story to understand how tenuous that was in terms of its creation. And I think it helps a lot in terms of understanding where we've come from since then. So I'd like to ask Jason to come up and to offer his perspective.
Thank you. I actually do have a PowerPoint presentation, and there we go. Good. I don't know if we can turn the lights down a little bit so people can see the pictures better. I like pictures. I'm going to talk a bit about, similar to what Jean said, in 1982, everyone said, that's a watershed moment. It's all going to change. And I was 7 at the time, and I don't really remember it. But I do remember 2003. I was a baby lawyer then, Margaret, not so much anymore. But I remember Powley, and I thought, everything's going to change. That's a watershed moment. And it was, in many respects, similar to what 1982 was as well. But in practicality of what it's meant on the ground, not so much. And I think that over the last decade, we've been trying to fill in that, I don't know if it's a coloring book or that picture about what 1982 was about. And we have to remember what Section 35 says. It says it recognizes that there are Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples, that there's a people there. And the problem that I think that the Métis historically have faced and continue to face today is that people don't see us as that. They're just a bunch of mixed bloods. They're just a bunch of people who can't get status. We don't see them as a people. And I think Jean's written extensively on this, as well as published her master's on it. And what I think our work has been since Powley is to color that out, of saying this idea that everything was dealt with through the treaties and in Ontario and on the plains, and that it's all about we dealt with those issues, we dealt with those rights issues. What Powley essentially says is, no, there's another Aboriginal people there, and you need to see them as that, and you need to understand them as that. And I think over the past, since Powley, we've been trying to get people to understand that, and I think that's what the cases are getting us to. So I'm going to talk about where the case law is today, where I see it going, and what I see on the horizon. And there has been some progress, and I'm going to talk about that because I think we have moved from the courts in some places to negotiations, and in some places we actually have agreements. Now, whether those are ultimately successful in overcoming the challenges we face about a lack of law and being operated under policy when it comes to Métis, I'm not sure, but I do think that the yardstick does continue to be moved and that progress is being made. So I want to start with this concept about who this people are, and for those of you who have seen Jean and I speak over the years, we've presented on this issue often, but I think it's helpful to give a brief refresher of who the Métis are. They're children of the fur trade and marriages between Indian women and the voyageurs. Successive generations of intermarriage create a unique culture in the Northwest. We have ethnogenesis, which essentially means birth of a culture between the late 1700s and the early 1800s throughout the Northwest. And what we see in the record is that we see initially these people being identified as traders, or the progenitor generation being identified as traders or freemen. You see that in the historic record in the late 1700s and the early 1700s. And then in that same period, you start seeing them talk about the children of these traders or the children of these freedmen. But they're seen as extensions. They're seen as appendages of the traders and the freemen. So they say the freemen and their sons, or the freemen and their children. And then what you actually start to see in the historic record by the beginning of the early 1800s is these people being identified as distinct, being called half-breeds, Canadians, Bras Brûlés. You see that they aren't just extensions of their Indian forebears or extensions of their freemen or trader ancestors. You see them being identified and seen as distinct. And that begins in areas not yet open to colonization. And this is a quote from the Supreme Court of Canada in Powley. It says, "The inclusion of the Métis in Section 35 represents Canada's commitments to recognize and value the distinct Métis cultures which grew up in areas not yet open to colonization and which the framers of the Constitution Act 1982 recognize can only survive if the Métis are protected along with other Aboriginal communities." So where is not yet open to colonization? Well, it's in the old Northwest. There's a period of time, and I think what's really important is that when you have a distinct birth of a culture, that culture needs to have some generations. It's not just, oh, well, there's a First Nations lady had relations with a freeman or a trader. The first generation is a mixed ancestry individual. Well, that's Métis. That is not Métis. I hate the line that essentially, oh, well, the first Métis appeared 9 months after the Europeans arrived on the East Coast. That's not correct. It's actually insulting to the Métis people, and it's not the truth. And what you have of who the Métis actually are is that you have successive generations being allowed to develop and emerge as their own distinct people. Not seeing themselves as extensions of their First Nation ancestors, and not just seeing themselves as extensions of their European progenitors, but that you actually see a distinct culture, a distinct language, a distinct way of life emerge. And that only happens in certain locations because in reality, in order to allow that to happen, they have to be undisturbed for a period of time. I call it, you have to allow that to incubate. And if that incubation doesn't occur or doesn't happen, what you really just have is mixed ancestry people who are extensions of Europeans and First Nations. But what you see in the Northwest is that ethnogenesis occurring, that they look to their left and they see their First Nation ancestors, and they look to their right and they see their European forebears, and they say, no, we're different. We're definitely connected, but we have our own identity, our own culture. And then when that culture is threatened, and I think this is really important, and this is actually what the courts look for, when that culture is threatened, they push back, and they push back as Métis. They clearly identify themselves as Métis, and they stand up and they assert their rights as Métis, and they're recognized by others as Métis. And that happens only in specific geographic areas in this country. That's what the facts show us. But it's also, that's fundamental to the idea of there being a people there or a distinct community there, that they see themselves as so much as that they're willing to defend it and they're willing to fight against being assimilated into other cultures. And that does occur within the Old Northwest. And what's interesting is that it's occurring all at the same point in time, that you see this emergence of people, you see the emergence of Métis and being identified as by others as distinctly Métis, but also asserting themselves as Métis. In the Upper Great Lakes, you see it as early as the 1790 to 1815, in southwest Manitoba around 1815, northwest Saskatchewan 1820, south and central Alberta in 1870. You see this happening in the Northwest all around the same time. We always thought that, I always thought, because some of that, everything began in the Red River, and that's where it all happened. And what is clearly, I've had my eyes opened, and also I think that through the court cases that Jean and I have had the opportunity to do in Ontario, in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, and in Alberta, that Red River myopia, or that narrative, is wrong. That idea that everything flowed from the Red River is not true. Fort Edmonton was just as important as what was happening in the Red River. The populations in that area actually rivaled Red River at various points in time. And so what we're finally getting to do through the court cases, as Jean talks about, that we're, I think I get to do that sometimes too, of that we get to tell the story. Because quite honestly, people don't know the story. People don't, there's an assumption of what the story is. And previously it was, well, there is no story, there's no Métis people, they all died with Riel. I think then the historic record showed, oh, well, yes, there were, but they were all in Red River. And I think that's just as much of a fallacy as that they all died with Riel. And I think scholars like Brenda McDougall and others have worked on, coming to terms with that narrative maybe was good for some, but it's actually not good for all. And I think that what you see with this ethnogenesis is that there is a people that emerge in the Northwest, and they're a very mobile and an interconnected people. They aren't emerging as people in silos. And what's bringing them together is the fur trade. What's bringing them together is a highly mobile culture and lifestyle. And what's bringing them together is essentially the fact that they need each other in order to survive. And I think there's an interdependency that people don't grasp of that, oh, well, those are the buffalo hunters on the plains, and we're talking about the boreal forest Métis in northwest Saskatchewan. They don't understand that those groups are interdependent on each other. They need each other. They're fundamental to allowing this emergence of a distinct people come to be in what we call the Northwest. So Jean's presentations in the past have identified, we know these well-known bases of strategic settlement, whether it's Lac La Pluie up in Fort Frances, or whether it's Sault Ste. Marie, or whether it's locations like Penetang in Ontario, whether it's the Red River Settlement, whether it's Fort Edmonton. These are bases of operation, but they're essentially just, they're the settlements where the Métis are that are part of a much larger network. The much larger network is made up, largely driven around the fur trade, but it's made up of, when you're on the prairies, you're looking at the Red River carts. When you're looking up in the north, you're seeing the brigade routes of the York boats. And what you're actually seeing in Ontario is those wonderful waterways of the canoe, the Voyageur canoes that interconnect these people. And so Brenda's going to talk about this idea that the Ontario Métis are distinct from Manitoba Métis, or distinct from Alberta Métis, is a fallacy as well. This underground network or highway brought those people together. And there are commonalities between them. I have there's not a monolithic concept. There definitely is regional variations, but they aren't discrete and they aren't separate from each other. That's what the historic facts are showing us. So here's kind of the different routes of whether it's the Voyageur canoes in Ontario, the York boats, or the Métis of the plains. And the idea that these are different people or different cultures is just simply not the truth. So what we have, and I've stolen Jean's map because Jean has done a master's thesis on who the Métis of the Northwest are, and this is her map that she kind of says, look, this is what we keep on seeing as what the historic research is showing us of where these people are. And I want to say these lines are very shady. They're not, this is exactly where it goes. I want to put up this map, though, because I want to put up this map of what we've been kind of doing over the last 10 years is coloring in this map. We've been shading it in because people don't see that. They keep on going, well, where are the communities within this larger group? And from our perspective, from what we see, is that they aren't separate, distinct communities. What you have is a people, and you have to see them as an actual Aboriginal people that are interconnected through the various communities and settlements that they may have. So Powley gives us this wonderful quote from the Supreme Court of Canada, and it focuses on communities. And as opposed to, and it was really what Powley was about, it was about proving that, one, the Métis had Aboriginal rights, two, that they actually were an Aboriginal people, even though Section 35 said it about that, and it wasn't about proving the entire Métis Nation's existence. Essentially, the case was framed around overcoming those basic fundamental denials and focusing in on Sault Ste. Marie. And what comes out of Powley, though, is the definition of what is a Métis community. So a Métis community can be defined as a group of Métis with a distinctive collective identity, living together in the same geographic area and sharing a common way of life. So the Supreme Court of Canada gives you a definition that you can drive a Mack truck through, or any 7 different people can read it and kind of going, well, of course it means this, of course it means that. So I think for the last decade since the release of Powley, we've been in the courts arguing about, we haven't been arguing about are there Métis there, we haven't been arguing about do they hunt, we've been arguing about what is the community. And that has been really the challenge, or one of the biggest bones of contention, because what you have as our clients, the Métis Nation, and keep on, they are so reluctant, they aren't even just reluctant, they are so adverse to drawing lines, because the problem is that they know whenever you start drawing those lines break down so quickly. And they refuse to do it because they know it doesn't fit for who they are and how they exercise their rights or how their community operates. And so those lines have been really, I guess, the fault lines of why we probably haven't had more agreements up until recently, because there has been a reluctance or a complete avoidance and an unwillingness to be sucked into the mugs game of, okay, show us the dot and we'll draw a circle around the dot. It's like, and I think that's one of the, I guess, what we've been pushing forward on in the case law. So since Powley, there's been a series of cases in the East Coast which haven't recognized that there's Métis rights existing there. And I think one of the most recent cases is R.V. Vauteur, and I think the judge in this case really hones in on what the challenge is in those East Coast. And it really comes down to, yes, there are mixed ancestry people. Absolutely, there's mixed ancestry people. The documentary record shows that. But what you don't see in the evidence, or what hasn't been before the courts in the East Coast yet, is this idea that they see themselves as a distinct Métis community, and they assert themselves as that. And so here's what the judge says in relation to a most recent case out of the East Coast. It says, it is this shadow community that the Vauteurs point as proof of their existence of a historic Métis community, and upon which their claim to Section 35 is partly rooted. One of the difficulties with the concept of a shadow community brings to the fore is that if one is to identify it, the community must, of necessity, have had visibility at some point in time. One cannot always have remained invisible, and I can find no solid historical indicators of Chief Augustine's report or his testimony that points to this existence. The remarks in the above excerpt of his testimony about Métis people in a biological sense living among the Acadian and the Mi'kmaq people, but that hardly signifies the formation of a separate community. I would agree with Dr. Van Gernot. There must be visible ethnicity at both sides of the period of invisibility. The reality is that what the courts are looking for is, do they see evidence of Métis people asserting themselves as distinctly Métis, as separate from First Nations and as separate from non-Aboriginal communities, and do others see them as such? And there's only, people can say, well, we haven't done the research there in those locations yet, and maybe there hasn't been, but what you continually see is that's what they're looking for in the courts, and hasn't been found in the East Coast as of yet. So for the Métis of the Northwest, after Powley, negotiations were undertaken in Ontario, where The Métis Nation of Ontario took the position that if we can prove it in the Sault Ste. Marie area, we can prove it in these other areas. And what was arrived at was an accommodation agreement of essentially saying, look, we agree to disagree in some areas, but for the interim, we're going to recognize this based upon the information we have, and we're going to jointly work on research in areas where there's disagreement, and also we're going to have an independent assessment of the registry system that the Métis themselves have put together. In Saskatchewan, Jean mentioned that there have been a series of cases in Saskatchewan, from the Morin and Dion case up in northwest Saskatchewan. That's the yellow area that was one, as well as La Violette, which we did following Powley, where they drew an arbitrary line across the province, and we took a case just south of it to prove that the line was wrong and arbitrary. Of course, we just won another 100 kilometers, but, and then we also took the Bellamere case, and that's in southern Saskatchewan around the Qu'Appelle Valley area. And what we've been just winning, though, is it's kind of little chunks here, there, and everywhere. And then we went to, so to give a little bit of the history, in Alberta following Powley, the province of Alberta negotiated a province-wide harvesting agreement with the Métis Nation of Alberta, because they recognized, or at least the government at that point in time, which was the Ralph Klein government, who was actually very, for all of his faults, he was actually very pro-Métis and very pro-First Nations on some aspects, and a lot was done in that province. Unfortunately, following Ralph Klein years, there was a even more regressive regime that came into play, and that was led by Ed Stelmach, as well as a man by the name of Ted Morton. Now, Ted Morton ran for the premiership, and he did not win, and his whole campaign was, if I win and I become premier, I'm going to kill that Métis harvesting agreement. Well, he didn't win, thankfully, for Albertans and for the rest of Canada, but the reality is that he did become the Minister of Natural Resources. And what did he do on his first day of becoming the Minister of Natural Resources? He killed that agreement. So there began the stage was set for Alberta Métis to bring forward cases. So after they canceled the interim Métis harvesting agreement, they essentially identified, and these black dots up on these black dots are essentially all where they've identified that these are historic and contemporary Métis communities. And what they essentially did is they drew 170 kilometer circles around all those communities and said, if you ancestrally connect to the dot, you can go hunting 170 kilometers around. Like I can just imagine the Métis harvester of, I remember those invisible gates or invisible fences that dogs have in the suburbs. It's like beep, 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 beep. I just can't imagine a voyager saying, oh my goodness, I've got to stop. It's 170 kilometers away from Lac La Biche. Can't go hunting any further. It's ridiculousness, but it's actually what their policy in Alberta is based upon. And of course they said no Métis rights south of essentially the North Saskatchewan River, south of this area, because somehow we couldn't figure out how to get the Métis voyageurs on the plains couldn't figure out how to get south of Fort Edmonton. It really doesn't make sense. And so what we have taken, what we then took, is a case which of saying we kept on winning little chunks, and Jean highlighted for you the problems of whenever we kept on winning at the lower level, we would win, and then the governments wouldn't appeal the cases up further. So the great thing is that we have the equivalent to Mike Harris in Alberta at the time of saying, we know that even if we win, they'll appeal it in Alberta. Now, interestingly enough, since it is Alberta, we lost when we took the case forward in Alberta. So what we did take was a test case in southern Alberta, and it's in the Cypress Hills area. And Gary Hersicorn is a Métis hunter, and he's lived in Cypress Hills since the 1950s, but he actually comes from the Red River and up in areas around Fort Ellis and Sandy Lake, and also the Red River settlement. And so what our argument is you can't look at Cypress Hills as discrete from Wood Mountain, as discrete from the Red River. This is one community. The buffalo hunters used this as an entire community. And it is not the dots, it is the larger. So we decided of saying, well, let's go big or go home. It is Alberta nonetheless. And we took the case to say, we knew that if you don't find the larger community, Gary Hersicorn, doesn't have harvesting rights, because we just don't believe that Métis, who are known for their mobility, if they move between locations within the larger Métis Nation, that they lose their harvesting rights. And so the case is based upon that. Now, I will say we've been wholly unsuccessful, and we're now set to be at the Alberta Court of Appeal in February 7th. We're arguing it at the Alberta Court of Appeal. But it's based upon the larger principle that the community cannot be understood by dots and cannot be understood by settlements. And really, we call this similar to how Sparrow came along, and then 10 years after, to provide clarification, Vanderpeet came along. Well, now we've essentially we have Powley, and we're going to have Hersicorn soon, which says, okay, what did you mean when you said community? Did you mean we're supposed to be looking for dots, or can we look at what the people actually look like? Here's some evidence. I just love this. This is the only case that I've ever done, and that Jean's ever done, where we actually have photographic evidence. They say Métis weren't in southern Alberta prior to 1874. Well, here's a photo that a whole bunch of scientists take when they're doing the Boundary Commission routing in 1874, and they actually take the photo, and this is how far that location in 1874 is. That's the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, and that's where Gary Hersicorn was hunting in 2007. I don't know how more site-specific you need to get on that. In British Columbia, research is still ongoing. And in Manitoba, I think we have some positive developments. If you may have heard, there was a recently negotiated harvesting agreement in the province of Manitoba, and it's actually based upon, why we couldn't get to an agreement after the Goodon case, which essentially established harvesting rights in southern Manitoba, was what the Crown wanted us to do was, okay, pick dots and let's draw circles around those dots. And the Manitoba Métis were completely avoided that. And what we've continued to push for since 2009, when the Goodon case came down, was saying, you have to look at this as one community. So finally, after years of negotiation, this has been recognized as one community. So this is roughly 800,000 square kilometers. And this is all one Métis community. What we were actually won in Goodon was about this area right here, and it's been expanded based upon research. The key parts of the agreement are that the Manitoba government recognizes that there's collectively held Métis rights all within this area. They also recognize, for the purposes of identification, the Manitoba Métis Federation's Harvester's Card, and they recognize the Manitoba Métis Federation's laws of the hunt. And in addition to that, what they say, in order to avoid, and it goes back to Jean's point about we just didn't want to do this by policy anymore, the agreement makes the commitment that they will referentially incorporate the MMF's laws of the hunt into their provincial regulations. So it will actually become Métis laws will govern the Métis harvest in Manitoba. And we're currently in the process of drafting those regulations, and they will be introduced this fall. So it's the first time that you've actually seen Métis jurisdiction carved out for the purposes of their hunting rights. And I think that's quite exciting, and I think that actually overcomes some of the challenges we've been having where it's all been about policy and discretion. Now we're actually going to have law that Métis can rely on. The other aspect of this is that pink area is not just those are the only areas. There's a 2-year process that's been identified in the harvesting agreement of saying, in areas where we're still agree to disagree, up in this area in particular, on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, in addition as up along the Nelson River area, we're going to undertake joint research, and in 2 years, we're going to hopefully expand the pink area to a larger area. And if we don't get to an agreement at the end of 2 years, we'll bring forward a reference to the Manitoba Court of Appeal on where we still have disagreements. So I think this is kind of, and the other point on this is that there's no cap on the number of harvester's cards that the Manitoba Métis Federation can issue. If you meet the criteria, the eligibility criteria, you're able to obtain an MMF harvester's card and hunt within this territory. So I think that kind of shows you of where the cases have been pushed to. And I hope, we're also now sitting at the table in Saskatchewan, and I hope that this will become a prototype for future agreements on Métis harvesting rights and kind of pushing the yardstick even further. That, combined with the Hersecorn case, we hope will, I guess, move the yardstick even further than we've had in the past. I was going to talk about, and so this is just my last map of what we've actually won, or what this is looking like. So and I want to bring it back to the Métis of the Northwest. So the purple areas, these are areas where the governments have accommodated. So they've essentially either by policy or by negotiated agreement. So in Ontario, that's where the agreement is. This is where the Powley case is from. That's actually where Métis rights have been established. In Goodon, in Manitoba, this is where the Goodon case was. This is actually where they've recognized harvesting rights. And you can see it's slowly filling out. This is the area that's under litigation in Alberta. And so you can slowly see that we're filling in the picture slowly at great length and great expense, but we're getting there. And so when you look at Jean's map, and when you look at what we've got, we're getting there. Not quite yet, and it's not just on a community by community basis. What we're really trying to illustrate is that there's another people there, a distinct Aboriginal people who have Aboriginal rights as Métis, and it's I guess, part of the story that's often untold. So with that, I am done.
Thank you, Jason. Great to get those visuals. I think that's very helpful, and you've done a great job at showing us sort of where we've come from a litigation perspective. And as Jean and Jason have mentioned, research is just central to proving any rights. And so that's why we are so excited to have a Métis chair, research chair, and the work that Brenda is doing is going to be critical to advancing our rights across the country. So, Brenda?
IBM. I'm a Mac user, so he has to fix this first.
Okay, and where's yours? La Framboise.
Cool.
So just do that.
Cool, thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming today, and thank you for coming, most of you, I think, to the legislature grounds today. I'd like to thank Marisha and Joanne for doing all of this organizing and getting us all here. And so Jason has talked a little bit about some of the stuff that I'm going to cover. And really, what I'm going to do today is kind of look at some narrative arcs of this particular family, the La Framboise. And I'm not using them as a, they're not an anomaly, but I'm using them as a case example. So what I'll talk about today with the La Framboise are things that you will see with other families in other regions. And the reason I picked the La Framboise is because I'm not sure if I'm stalking them or if they're stalking me. But I've known about them, I think, for about the last 20 years. I met my first, in the first class I taught of Métis history, I had a young woman in the class by the name of Shelby La Framboise. And I had set up an assignment where their job was to do their family histories. And we went to Winnipeg and we looked through archives, and we did archives in Saskatchewan. And she said, you know, I don't know enough about my family, and I don't have a lot of living relatives. It's just really my dad left, and, you know, his mom has died, and we don't know anything. And I think that, you know, we're just poor and we don't know very much. And I wasn't much help because I hadn't done very much research into family histories at that point, and I couldn't really direct her in any particular way. Since I met Shelby 20 years ago, I find La Framboise everywhere. And I actually send her emails every so often updating, here's some more. And enjoy yourself. You're not actually from a very small family. You're from one of the largest families I've ever seen. And your family actually covers the entire expanse of some of the homeland maps that Jason has been showing us today. And so I think it's important to bear in mind, because they're not an anomaly, these are a group of people that resonate within a lot of our families, in a lot of our communities. And so I think they're well worth spending some time with. Now, part of what I want to dispel, Jason did a little bit of that, is this notion of Red River. Red River is a retirement community for old fur traders. That's where Red River comes from. Apparently someone's not from Red River. you know, people went to Red River in 1812 to 1815 to retire. This is not where they were from. Where they are from is the Great Lakes basins, from the American side, from the lower Great Lakes, all the way through Montana, Idaho, from Fort Edmonton, all along the Saskatchewan rivers, from the north. These people migrate to Red River to retire, and that's why they're there. This is not the center of where they're from. So I'm going to start in Fort Edmonton with the Laframboise there. We have the first recording of a Laframboise at Fort Edmonton in 1816. He's hired by the Hudson's Bay Company to work at the Fort Edmonton Post. He works closely with a man by the name of Jean-Baptiste Ecopow Dumont. And this becomes important because Joseph Laframboise and Jean-Baptiste Dumont's children start to intermarry. And so what I do is genealogies. I trace family histories based on how they're connected to one another and what the alliance formations start to look like. Now, Joseph Laframboise and his wife are at the bottom of the diagram, and at the top of the diagram are Jean-Baptiste Ecopow Dumont and his wife, Suzette, or Josette Sarcey. And these are their children in the middle. And the connectors, you'll see the equal signs. Those are marital alliances between the Dumonts and the Laframboise at Fort Edmonton. 2 sons marry 2 daughters, 1 daughter marries a son. And this is common. This is not an unusual decision-making pattern amongst Métis families. We see this reproduced over and over again. There are very specific families that ally with one another at very specific times, and we start to see this happen intergenerationally. So this is just the first generation. When we look at the 3rd and the 4th generation, we see much more of this kind of intermarriage between those families starting to take place. And so it really takes place over 6 and 7 generations that you see this happening. So why in Edmonton? I mean, what possibly about the Edmonton region is important? Well, this is a major buffalo provisioning site. Fort Edmonton is the center of York boat construction for the north. It's also where most of the pemmican meat that is harvested by Métis hunters actually goes through this post, and it gets transformed into pemmican, it gets sent up into the northern water systems. It's the food supply for the fur trade. This is the food chain. And so everything happens through here. And as a result, at any given time in Fort Edmonton's history, there's between 60 and 150 Métis families settled in and around the fort. It doesn't mean that they're living there permanently. What they're doing is they're moving between sites. They're moving between other fur regions. They're moving into the northern districts as they move the pemmican. They're hunting on the southern plains, bringing the pemmican supplies in. Those aren't the only Laframboise. It's just simply one of the first families in the Great Lakes at the same time that we see the Joseph Laframboise family intermarrying with the Dumonts. We also have a branch of the Laframboise families down in the Great Lakes. I don't know yet what the connection is between these 2 families. They may be cousins, but what we do know is that there are 2. By 1760 in Trois-Rivières, there are 2 brothers who are fur traders who leave Trois-Rivières to go out into various parts of the Northwest to work. Very likely these are where the 2 branches of those families originate from. The other thing that starts to recur very often is that everybody is named Joseph. So our next Laframboise family is also led by Joseph Laframboise. He disappears from the story very quickly. He's actually murdered in 1804 in a trade deal gone bad. It's sort of an unfortunate situation. He was stabbed to death. But this woman, Madeleine Laframboise, is his wife, and she carries on his trade empire. She becomes one of the wealthiest women in the American Great side of the Great Lakes in all of its history. And that is her house next to her picture. So this is a woman of great means. She actually was able to retire from the fur trade by the age of 41. She sold her business to the American Fur Company, And in the process of selling her rights to her fur posts, she secured a job for her son for life with the American Fur Company. Her son is also named Joseph Laframboise. There's not a lot of originality in historical naming, by the way. This makes genealogies very difficult, is sorting them all out. So at the top, we have the parental generation, Joseph Laframboise and his mother, his wife, Madeline. And then the two children that descend from them are Joseph Laframboise and a daughter by the name of Josette. Yeah, I know, it makes it hard. Josette actually marries the brother of a man who eventually becomes president of the United States. She marries Benjamin Pierce, and his brother is the American president much later. She dies before he becomes president, so she's never the first lady. But her brother Joseph has a very long and very active fur trade career. He has 3 wives. The first 2 were women who were members of the Saskatchewan Dakota tribe. It's very likely that it was a polygamous marriage arrangement. We can't tell from the dates exactly what went on. Some of the record keeping is a little shifty from back then. And then his 3rd wife is Jane Dixon, and these are all of his children by those 3 women. What happens in the life career of Joseph Laframboise is that he sees a lot of changes. He doesn't stay in the land that he was born. He doesn't stay in the southern Great Lakes. He has to leave to work. His mother has sold her business. But more than that, it's not that she sold up and retired. It's that by the time he is old enough to work, things have changed radically in the place where he was from. They've changed radically at Mackinac. We now see American settlement in that area. We have more pressure from the Dominion of Canada into the Great Lakes region. And so you see a compression of the fur trade, and you see fewer and fewer opportunities for young men in that region. And so to continue trading is to move, and to move further west and south into, and in some cases north, into new fur opportunities. In the case of Joseph Laframboise, he simply goes south and west into the Minnesota territories, really up to about South Dakota is the area that he's operating in along the Minnesota River. And what he witnesses in the course of his lifetime is these huge transitions in a way of life. And so he does the best that he can for his children, in the sense that some of them are actually enrolled with Dakota Dakota American Indian bands in the United States. They become Dakota. And like him, his eldest son becomes an interpreter and trader. And this is his son, Joseph Edward, his eldest son, and his daughter, Julie. These two have very different lifeways, in a sense. Joseph, like his father, goes into the trade. He becomes a guide, and he actually guides surveyors along the 49th parallel as they set the American-Canadian boundary in the west. Julie ends up on a treaty list. She actually goes into treaty, and her descendants are now all First Nation or American Indians in the United States. So you see one branch of the family remain Métis, remain in that trade environment, remain in that economy, and you see another branch of the family move into treaty. And this is not uncommon. It also happens in Canada quite often. So the infamous Red River. We're sort of here almost with Joseph Laframboise's life. It's not actually Red River that's important historically, it's Pembina. Pembina is just to the south of the American border. It's just by happenstance that it is not in Canada. It's where the survey route took them along the 49th. This is the largest collection of Métis people in the late 1700s, early 1800s. They're not at the junction of the Red and the Assiniboine River, which is where we think of as being the Métis homeland. They're much further south on the Red River. What's important about this geography is that it's an easy move westward following Buffalo. If you actually move up into the Red River region, you get flooded out every spring. Who's been to Winnipeg? You know, it's not a great place to be when the ice breaks. And so everybody congregated in the Pembina region. And we have lots of recorded instances of the Métis in this region, including people by the name of La Fombois, as early as the 1790s, 1780s. So what we're seeing is, as Jason described, is that these families are actually developing their histories in very different areas at the same time. They all descend from a basic branch of traders coming out of the Trois-Rivières area, but they don't all go to the same place. But there's also not this natural east-west migration. It doesn't start in eastern Canada and slowly make its way west. That's settler history. That's Canadian national history. That is not Métis history. And so we need to stop thinking of our history in terms of Canadian history, because we don't share the same trajectory. We don't share the same timeline. We don't share the same experiences. Our experiences are on both sides of that border. And our experiences are not of people who are poor and who don't have much, which is what Shelby thought her family history was. These are people who have incredible skills that are needed and necessary. It's needed and necessary first by fur trade. These are people who speak multiple languages. That picture of Madeleine La Fombois with that house that I showed you, that woman spoke six different languages. That's why she was such a successful trader. She could communicate with everybody in her immediate vicinity. But she was also successful because she was fair and honest in her dealings. And that's what's written about her over and over again, and that is what she kept reminding her son to be when he went out and started doing the same occupation. It may not have been exactly what her husband may have been, which is perhaps why he was murdered in a trade deal gone wrong. But the people who were the most successful are the people who had skill sets that translated into things that other people required. And so what we see with the La Fombois family is they're spread into the Great Plains and out of the woodlands, but also down from Fort Edmonton and onto the plains by about the mid-1800s. And what seems to be happening at that point is everybody is in pursuit of the buffalo. Buffalo becomes the dominant economy of that trade. And so you see people actually moving out of the river systems and into the parklands in search of those animals. You see people moving out of the boreal forests and down onto the Great Plains. So we'll go back to Joseph La Fombois and his wife Josephette Assiniboine, because I want to talk about, thankfully not another Joseph, but a Jean-Baptiste. Just down here. Jean-Baptiste La Fombois is known as John La Fombois. Things start to become a little bit anglicized, but he was born about 1850 in Moose Mountain, which is in Saskatchewan, and he's married to a woman by the name of Marguerite Cayenne Diet Boudreau. And they have 10 children that are born between Duck Lake, the Qu'Appelle Valley, and Medicine Hat, but also down in Montana. And so they have birth certificates that range from a variety of different church records that we've been able to track down. What we know about Jean-Baptiste La Fombois actually comes from his obituary. He died at the age of 96, in his 90s, in 1944 in Maple Creek. And he had a 2-page obituary in the Maple Creek newspaper, which is not a big newspaper, but still, a 2-page obituary is kind of impressive. He was described as a buffalo hunter. He had been on some of the last buffalo hunts that had ever taken place in the western prairies. His father had been a buffalo hunter. His grandparents had all come from buffalo hunting brigades. And what we see in this genealogy is that the La Fombois family, by the time they reach the central prairies, are actually connected with the Trotchy family. And the Trotchy family are also well-known buffalo hunters. And Charles Trotchy, the wife of Marie Trotchy, his mother, Charles Trotchy was one of the lieutenants in 1885. He actually led his own militia in 1885 and fought with Riel at the Battle of Batoche. Most of these people were forced into the United States after 1885. They took refugee status in the American side for about, in some cases for about 20, 25 years, and in other cases, they remained in the United States. Some of John's children stayed in the United States and went onto the Rocky Boy Reservation. Some of them are now activists in the Little Shell tribe, trying to gain American Indian status for the Little Shell people. And some of them are in Saskatchewan living as Métis people. All of them are cousins, all of them are related to each other, and they know that. And I think one of the most remarkable things about our genealogies is that while some of us have forgotten our histories, like, you know, something happened in Shelby's family where there was a bit of a rupture, but these people up until the 1940s never lost contact with each other. We have all sorts of historical documents that show that people were maintaining letters amongst each other, children were being sent to Trois-Rivières to go to school. In fact, this lady, Marguerite Fafard de la Fombois, she is the grandmother of most of the people in the genealogies that I've put up. She took in several of her grandchildren's generation and put them through school in Trois-Rivières before sending them back west to work. This lady herself is not Métis, but she is part of our ancestral tree. She's responsible for the educating of scores of Métis children and making sure that they were capable of going back out and working, but also that they remained connected, in this case, to their French-Canadian roots. Now, she was married to a Grant, not a French-Canadian name. These are also the Scottish half-breeds. And that's the other thing that gets forgotten in Métis history when we create this narrative about Red River, is that Red River is the site of French, Catholic, Métis history. There were 6,000 half-breeds in that community on the eve of the 1869 rebellion, resistance. 6,000 were Scottish half-breeds. These are our families as well. We can't forget that we have this Scottish ancestry. That's kind of why I pulled out the plaids today. Wanted to make that point, but it keeps falling off, so I have to give it up. So our families are hugely interconnected with each other. The La Fombois are, in many respects, are a conduit to connect to other families. The Dumonts, the Trotchys, the Grants, Perantos, Cayennes, and we start to see these families interwoven with each other, and we see them interwoven with each other intergenerationally. This doesn't happen once. It's not ever a one-off deal. We see sons and daughters marrying. We see grandchildren marrying. And to me, these appear to be very deliberate choices. It is not accidental, because what we see happening is that people in very specific niches make sure that their children and grandchildren remain connected to those power economic bases. And so the other idea I think that rings false about Red River is that somehow it's the site of political nationalism, that this is where the birth of all sorts of political deep thinking and even law took place. Métis people are historically infamous petition writers. So all y'all have a big history that you're living up to if you're in Métis government. Petitions didn't start in the 20th century. We have documented almost 30 petitions from Western Canada to the Great Lakes that Métis people have been submitting to Canadian and American governments since the early 1800s. Petitions demanding observation of their rights to hunt, asking for land recognition, making sure that they have land bases for their kids and grandchildren. They were requesting treaties as early as most of the First Nations people were requesting treaties. They knew that times were changing, and they could see it happening all across the country because they were interconnected with one another so deeply. So when Joseph La Fombois from the Great Lakes region leaves the Great Lakes, he does so because treaties are being signed, because that's constricting the trade. Information like that gets transmitted into another zone when he leaves and starts to see more treaties being negotiated. And at every step of the way, what we see happening is that Métis people were asking for their rights to be recognized, to be signed into treaties, not as First Nations people or as Indian people, but as distinct groups. And when those overtures were rejected, they simply picked up families and moved to the next place where there was no settlement to start over. And so it's this constant history of starting over. of renewing themselves, but never leaving each other behind, and never forgetting about the legacy of what all of those things meant. And we see that in the petition writing. You know, the first time I saw a petition, I thought, where did they learn how to do this? And then I found 20 more petitions. And I started tracing the names on those petitions, and from the first one that I found, then I found the parents' generation writing petitions. Then I found the grandparents' generation writing petitions. They've always known how to do this. They're not contacting some lawyer, Jason, and asking them to do this. They know how to do this. They know how to assert themselves. And really, when it comes right down to it, 1885 was just sort of the final moment where all else had failed. But they took another shot. And after 1885, as we saw today, people regrouped. They took a little breather, regrouped, and started again. And so, but I guess what I'll leave you with is that we need to not forget what they did before us. We're not recreating the wheel. If we look back into our history and really look back into it and not worry about what other people have in other parts of the country, but really look into what we have in the places that we're from, we'll see these legacies. And once we understand the legacies in the place that we're from, we can start making those connections into other places and understanding why that happened there too. And not seeing ourselves as isolated, small things that don't have much or don't have a lot of relatives anymore. We have relatives everywhere. We just have to pay attention to the links and pieces of evidence that they left us. So that's where I'll stop for today. Oh, I'm going to stop here, actually. This, to me, is what we are. And this is Christy Belcourt's painting. She did it for the midwives here in Toronto. I saw an image of it on the web last night when I was putting together the final pieces of the PowerPoint. And to me, this speaks to who we are. We're the whole. We're not the piece. Thank you.
What a beautiful way to end. We have just a few minutes for questions. Can I ask if there's anyone in the room that's interested in asking one? Would you like to come to a mic, please?
Thank you, Brenda. That was really enlightening. I know in my own family history search, I kept finding myself not going from east to west, but starting in the middle and spreading out to the east and to the west, and even into the United States. And it's a really fascinating journey. But one of the things that I want to ask you about was petitions. In searching my family history, one of my fur trade ancestors ended up in Oregon. And as people may or may not realize, a lot of Métis families migrated to Oregon in the 1840s from Red River. And there was about 23 families at least. There were two different expeditions of them that were led by James Sinclair. So I found a petition, a handwritten petition that was where these Métis families were caught. They were caught when they established the border. They were caught on the American side. And this is a handwritten petition asking to become United States citizens. And it's interesting because they argue that that they are educated, that they can speak English, that they're good citizens, they've been honest, and all these kinds of things. And I didn't know, though, I couldn't find any information as to what the answer to that petition was. Do you know at all what that history might be?
I don't know the answer to that petition. All of these, if they sent them to the American government, they're all collected with the congressional papers, and so you'll probably find the transcription of that one there, and in the congressional discussions, you'll probably see the resolution. In the United States, they had to make requests for either citizenship or Indian status. And so this particular group of people made requests for citizenship. But this happens all the way along the 49th parallel, where you see people trapped by the border as it comes through. And once they're trapped by the border, the Canadian government will see them as aliens trying to migrate back up, and the American government treats them as
illegals or aliens, yeah, aliens, not quite illegals, but aliens, and uses language like they're old French Canadians, or they're they're from those tribes in Canada and they don't really belong here, and they try to sometimes move them back across the border. But the outcome very well may simply be that they got citizenship, and as soon as you get citizenship, you disappear in the records because you become like any other Canadian. At least if you're on the reservation lists, we can continue to track them in a different sense. But I suspect they simply became Americans.
Yeah. Okay, and there's just one other thing I wanted to comment on your La Foi Bois story. This is something I came across in research. It was in, there's an article in 1875 that was printed in the Winnipeg Press about this horrific fight that happened between two families, and one of them was the Lafon Brawl, these brothers. It started out in a bar, and it was election time, and then people were on two different sides of the election, and then the one group of men followed the other one home, and it ended up in this massacre, and many women and children also got killed. And so it's an interesting article, but the thing is, at the end of the article, they said, this is really telling about the racial...
The character of those people.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because nobody else gets into fights, but...
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And that was a little bit of a downer comment, by the way, to end on. Just after that beautiful closing from Brenda, I'm just teasing. You know, I think I go back to what Brenda was just saying, that we need to look at our stories and understand where we came from to really, truly understand our relationships. And that speaks to not just who we are historically, but who we are today. And I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you all for coming here. I'm sorry we don't have any more time for questions. But Brenda and Jason are going to stick around, so they will be available. We have been really fortunate to hear from two of Canada's top Métis lawyers and our research chair. We have Maria Campbell, Elder Maria Campbell here, who's a Trudeau Fellow, who's also doing research. We've been very fortunate today. I wanted to thank the Law Society for putting this on, and Marisha for organizing, Susan for welcoming us. These events are so important to continue this dialogue, and so thank you all for being here and for being a part of it, and I'd encourage you to stick around to have some time to ask all the questions that you wanted to but didn't have time. And I'll also ask you, there should be, if you picked it up on the way in, an evaluation form, and that's really important to give feedback to the Law Society on this program and to give them a sense of what you'd like to see in the future. So I'd really encourage you to fill out that evaluation form. It'll help them to continue to improve their programs. And I just wanted to thank the panelists so much for what you've offered. Jean unfortunately had to leave. She had a flight to catch. But this basically concludes our program, this part of the program for today. We're going to have refreshments in room C, which is just outside these doors. And then we're going to be back here in this room at 4:30 for a very wonderful reception. We've heard a lot from academics and lawyers. We need to balance that out, and we need to hear from our artists and our performers. So come back at 4:30 and we'll continue with the celebration.
Hello. Once again, I'm Susan Hare, and I'm pleased to act as your MC for the reception part of this event today. Our program today features a musical performance by Rebecca Cuddy and a reading by acclaimed author and scholar Maria Campbell. Rebecca Cuddy is a Métis citizen with the Credit River Métis Council. Rebecca is a second-year vocal performance and modern language major at Western University. As a performer, Rebecca sings with the Western University Singers and appeared at the Port Dover Métis Rendezvous in September. Rebecca hopes to use performance to entertain and to shed light on important issues. Being Métis, one such issue close to her heart is awareness of Indigenous history and rights. Rebecca will now perform the three Métis songs by Malcolm Forsyth. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Cuddy.
Thank you very much. So before I begin, I'd just like to say thank you for having this opportunity. I'm very honored to be performing for you today. And as said before, I'm Rebecca Cuddy, and I'm a second-year student at the University of Western Ontario. Today, I will be performing a set of 3 songs entitled 3 Métis Songs from Saskatchewan by Malcolm Forsyth. The 3 Métis songs are a mixture of French and Michif. And before each one, I'll give a brief description of the lyrics. The first song I'll be singing is Chanson de la Petite Cordonnier. In this song, a young shoemaker falls in love with a Métis woman and asks for her hand in marriage. Though her brother knows he is a good man, her father refuses to let them marry, and the shoemaker leaves town with a broken heart. J'ai fait une maîtresse 3 jours il y a point longtemps. Le dimanche j'ai vu la demande, le lundi j'en fais la demande le lundi. Sans retarder, je m'en vais lui demander. Ton père qui nous écoute quand il me demande cela. Maman, tu m'auras pris ma fille, qu'elle me coûte de mille. En 1047, un garçon brillant, il la prendra pour son bien. Son frère qui tous écoute quand il entendit cela. Non, non, tu n'auras plus ma fille, qu'elle coûte 1000. En 1047, un garçon d'amour, le souci, savoir ma sœur. Lisette, oh ma Lisette, prête-moi ton mouchoir. Ça sera pour essuyer les larmes qu'elles coulent des sourmaux, blanc visage à des pleurs. Oh mes doux yeux, adieu, Lisette, adieu. Oh, des mouchoirs, des poches, mais j'en ai point sur moi. Allez-y, donnez dans ma chambre, s'ouvrir ma blonde toilette à la tête. Adieu mon lit, adieu donc mon bel ami. On a fait la chansonnette, c'est une petite cordonnier, à cheval sous ça, c'est un coup dans dessus, se met les encoignants, les 2 talons, qui a composé la chanson. Thank you. Stop. Okay, so the next song that I'll be singing is called Adieu à la mariée. And this is a song about a man saying goodbye to his wife and family because he's going on a journey from which he may not return. He sings about his life and his marriage and says his final goodbye to his loved ones. J'ai entendu vous a forcé? Qu'est-ce qui vous a fait prendre? C'est votre volonté. Je vous en demande aujourd'hui que dans le mariage, que de bénisse ces jeunes gens qui se mettent en ménage. Adieu, pères, adieu, mères, frères et sœurs et parents. Je m'en vais en ménage, ce n'est pas pour un an, c'est pour le restant de ma vie. Aller dans la misère, c'est pour le restant de mes jours. Je m'en vais en ménage. Okay, so this final song is Chanson de la Grenouillère, which I also performed this morning for anybody that was there. And this song is about war and the fight to keep hold of Métis land. And as I mentioned earlier, though it does sound very cheerful, it's not. So, yeah, just keep that in mind, I guess. All right. Voulez-vous écouter chanter une chanson de vérité? Le 19 de juin, la bande des pauvres nous sont arrivés comme des braves guerriers. En arrivant à la Grenouillère, nous avons pris 3 prisonniers. 3 prisonniers des Arcanis qui sont laissés pour briller notre pays. Étant sur la pointe de débarquer, de nos gens se sont mis à crier. De nos gens mis à crier, voilà l'anglais qui vient nous attaquer. La 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 la. Trop de rigueur, le gouverneur qui se croit tempérer à son malheur, agit
be through very good. La 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 la. La 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 la.
Thank you very much.
I don't know about the rest of you, but for the first few minutes, I had a little trouble transferring from listening to hard law to beautiful music. But it didn't take her long to put me right back where we should be. The circle is starting to come now. So thank you very much, Rebecca. That was so wonderful. Finally, I thank you all once again for joining us for today's program. It's come full circle. we learned a lot from Jean and Jason and Brenda and the president. We learned from her music. We learned from Maria. Thank you very much. Marisha, Roman, I thank you again for organizing this, for the tremendous work you do here. And Margaret Froh, thank you for coming and working with us this afternoon as usual. We thank you very, very much. The Law Society. The Law Society wishes again to extend its thanks to its community partner, the Métis Nation of Ontario, for its support in making today's event possible. Miigwech merci. Okay.